decision again
Yeah.
and overthrow what you were talking about?
Could. I mean, you know, if you look at the Occupy movements, I think there are kind of two major streams that I think are both important. One is kind of policy oriented. So we should do something about radical inequality. You know, we should have a financial transaction tax, or take away corporate personhood, or you know, fix up campaign financing. There's a lot of quite constructive, sensible suggestions on the policy side. The other part, which I think may be more important, is just forming communities. I mean, this is a very atomized society. People really are alone. I think some of the attractiveness of the social media, you know, Facebook, everybody's got to talk about themselves on Facebook. It's just there aren't any communities. You don't talk to your friends, you know, or your neighbors or something like that. And the internet kind of community is sort of anonymous. So you can kind of feel, you know, I'm really alone, even if I'm writing about my date last night, you know. So you got a lot of exhibitionism in the Facebook culture that people wouldn't do privately unless to a very intimate friend. And it's partly, I think, a reflection of the kind of alienation that's imposed on the society. People really are alone. It just didn't just happen. I mean, there are massive efforts to create this. The best way to control people is isolate them, atomize them, and make them, try to drive them to be concerned just with themselves, not anything else. And the Occupy movements, without planning to, just kind of broke out of that. They did create, people naturally interact that way if they have an opportunity. And when people converged in Scotty Park or Dewey Plaza down here or wherever it might be, they just quickly formed communities of mutual support and solidarity and helping one another and participating, you know. It's kind of striking that when Bloomberg sent the troops in to break it up, one of the first things they did was destroy the library. I think they destroyed thousands of books. And I think that's more than symbolic. They didn't have to destroy the books. That's essentially telling people, well, you can't do anything by yourself. You want to have a library, we're going to run it for you. Same with the health services and community kitchens and everything else. That's really threatening, because that does help people break out of isolation and recognize that you don't have to accept subordination. Going back to the women's movement again, that's pretty much the way it started. It started with very small consciousness-raising groups, small groups of people who would just talk to each other about oppression that everybody felt, but they didn't regard it as anything other than the normal life. You know, that's what life is. When you can talk to other people and you see it's not the way things have to be, we can do something pretty soon. It can spread very quickly. The civil rights movement is kind of the same. You know, it started, of course, it goes on back, you know, centuries, has deep roots. But in the really modern period, say since the 60s, it's started with small individual acts, like a couple of kids sitting at a lunch counter in Greensboro, getting arrested and hauled off. The next day, a larger group came in. And pretty soon you had Freedom Riders. And SNCC was formed. And pretty soon you had a big popular movement. Well, you know, all popular movements have something in common, but they're pretty different. The Paris Commune took over and ran the city. If you want to find a sort of kind of a parallel in American history, it would be, I think, more like what happened in Western Pennsylvania in the latter part of the 19th century, when, like in Homestead, where there were the mills and the mines and so on. There's a very powerful workers' movement at the time, and they essentially took them over. These were worker-run communities, and in fact, the state had to call in the National Guard to destroy them. It wasn't easy. Another parallel to the Occupy movement, which I don't know how well it's known, is Resurrection City. I don't know if anybody talks about that, but it's quite significant. If you look at, you take the history of the civil rights movement in the United States, say Martin Luther King, great figure, but look at what happened to King. I mean, if you listen to the speeches on Martin Luther King Day, they typically end, the enthusiastic rhetoric ends in 1963 with his I Have a Dream speech. Well, he gave another I Have a Dream speech, a very eloquent one. It was the evening he was assassinated in Memphis, Tennessee. And he was there to support a sanitation workers' strike. And he was on his way to Washington to try to organize a poor people's movement. The speech was, had a kind of biblical overtones, the kind he used, and it was basically, the theme was, I can see the promised land. He's saying, it's kind of like Moses. I can see the promised land. I know I'm not going to get there, but you will get there. And the promised land that he was talking about was not the right to vote. It was rights for poor people. He was concerned about life in the slums, the repression of the poor generally. I mean, it's, race, class are kind of correlated, so it's very heavily black, but not just black by any means. And then he was killed, and then the poor people, there was supposed to be a march from Memphis to Washington. Coretta King, his wife, his widow, led the march, and they went through all the embattled places in the South, Birmingham and Selma and so on. They ended up in Washington. They set up a tent city in Washington, Resurrection City, where it was going to be the base for approaching Congress to try to get some legislation which would deal with the plight of poor people. Well, Congress, which was the most liberal Congress in American history, they called the police and came in the middle of the night, and smashed up the camp and drove them out of the city. That's Resurrection City, tent city that, because as far as Northern liberals were concerned, if you wanted to denounce racist Alabama sheriffs, that was fine, but don't come near us. It's pretty routine. So, for example, in the 60s, in the anti-war movement, every group, it wasn't really, a lot of separate groups all over the place, but they all had to learn some lessons. One lesson that they had to learn pretty quickly is that if there's somebody in the group who's dressed like a Hollywood version of a hippie, and who's shouting, off the cops, or let's break some windows, or whatever, you're very likely to see him in court testifying for the police, because that's their job, Try to turn activism to something that will alienate the public and, break the law and give you grounds for repression. So they're all over. I mean, I was involved with groups that were dealing with resistance, so, deserters and people like that. But we quickly learned that if there's something really sensitive, we can't do it in a group. We have to do it in affinity groups if somebody's life is at stake, because the chances are there's somebody around who's an informant. And, that's what police do. You can tell by taking a look at the FBI cases that they've just been coming up with, the terrorism cases. They're almost all entrapment. Somebody gets in contact with a bunch of guys who kind of loose ends, don't know what they're doing, and confused, and suggest something to them, offer them some money, and pretty soon they're trying to stuff a fake bomb somewhere, and you arrest them and send them off to jail. I don't think it's the right question. I think the question is, why doesn't everybody do it? Because I think people would just do it naturally. You know, you look around you, you drive, you drive to work. There's a homeless person asking for money. Somebody else. This guy doesn't have a job. There's poverty everywhere. People you go past a hospital, people crowding to the emergency room because they can't see a doctor. And then you look at the rest of the world, not just rich areas like this, and it's shocking. So as soon as people are exposed to it, I think it's just automatic. And I happened to be exposed to it as a child. I grew up in the Depression, so people knocking on the door trying to sell rags and things like that. Lots of ways to do it. In fact, 99% and 1% wasn't in the media a year ago. Now it's routine discussion. People are thinking about things in a different way than they did before, just in the very few months of the Occupy movement. Actually, there's some polls on it, which maybe you've seen. There was I think a Pew poll, which asked people, has been asking people at various times, what do you think about inequality? And concern over inequality shot up very fast after September, just from the effect of, I assume it's the effect of the Occupy movement, which has just permeated a lot of mainstream discourse. Now that can be co-opting too, so sure, powerful systems will try to incorporate what they see as working and turn it to their own needs, whether it's human rights or you name it. Of course, that's what they'll try to do. So, for example, after the 2008 election, which generated a lot of enthusiasm, there was right after the election, there was the annual conference of the Advertisers Association, whatever they call themselves. And every year they give a prize for the best marketing campaign of the year. And that year they gave it to Obama. He beat out Apple computers. And if you take a look at the business press right afterwards, which was interesting, they quoting executives, CEOs, and so on. They're very excited about it. They said this is a new model for how we can behave to the public and in the boardroom and so on. We can use this model that worked so well at deluding people in the 2008 election. So sure, they not only ran it, but they learned lessons from it. The use of human rights is quite an interesting case, but it's true. Just, like say, there was a huge anti-nuclear movement in the early 1980s. It was, like huge demonstrations, millions of people try to get rid of nuclear weapons. And the Reagan administration cleverly co-opted it. They came out and said, yeah, great idea. We're all with you against nuclear weapons. Let's have Star Wars. That's how they got the Star Wars thing through, and they defused the movement. Made it sound as if it was opposed to nuclear weapons. Of course, we know what it was, but of course they're going to do that. And can you change the discourse? Sure. I mean, I don't know what I mentioned about the meeting with Lula. I don't know if you were quoting from it. It was kind of interesting. So, for example, this was before he was elected, and he was quite popular. If you looked at opinion polls, he was highest in the opinion polls, but he never won an election. Mostly it was because they were of corruption. The election was bought off. At the last minute, there's a huge flood of propaganda, advertising and so on. But I asked him at one point, did he think he ever would be able to win an election if there wasn't corruption and so on? And he said he didn't think it would be possible. And the reason was, what he said is, I know the mentality of the peasants. That's what I come from. And when they go into the voting booth and they ask themselves, could somebody like me run a country? They'll say, no, it has to be one of those rich white guys. So even if they want me, they're going to vote for those other people. A couple of years later, he won. The mentality changed. And it's changed all over Latin America. indigenous people, poor people. It's just a radical change. So of course it can be done. And the kind of thing that he took me to see in the suburb, which you mentioned, is one of the ways in which it can be done. And there are plenty of others. I mean, in Bolivia, around the same time, about 10 years ago, the mobilization on the effort to privatize water led to a real revolution in the country. The first time, hundreds of years, that the indigenous population has been able to enter the political arena and take over political power. It's kind of interesting the way the governments are reacting. The governments and the corporations still want to privatize water, but they learned that the Bolivian method is dangerous because it led to practically a revolution. They threw out the big corporations and so on. So I was in southern Colombia recently visiting villages, and what the government of Colombia is apparently trying to do is to pick the villages off, or the regions off, one at a time. So if you come into some poor, remote, endangered villages and you give them a line about how great the water will be if we just buy your land up there where the virgin forest is, you can maybe get them to accept it. Although strikingly they're resisting, they're organizing and resisting. But these things, from the point of view of the rich and powerful, class war never stops. It's permanent. They're involved in a constant, bitter class war, very self-conscious. They want everybody else not to participate, but they're always taking part, carrying it out. That's why they're rich and powerful. Well, the fact of the matter is we can do just about anything. I mean, with all, people like us, let's say, we wouldn't be here otherwise, are pretty privileged. And we have the kind of privilege that few people have ever had in history or have now. And if you have privilege, you have opportunities. And the opportunities are almost boundless. I mean, thanks to the struggles of the past, it hasn't always been like this, but thanks to the struggles in the past, there's a tremendous amount of freedom. I mean, the state may try to repress you, but they can't do a lot. I mean, they can pass the NDAA, let's say, but they can't really implement it against the will of the population. I mean, look, I think there's a lot of excessive concern in activist groups about state repression. I mean, it's not that it's not there. Sure, they'd like to do it. But first of all, it's always been there, and it's just kind of inherent in states and other power systems. And it's much weaker than it used to be. So it takes there's this paranoia about concentration camps. They're going to lock us up. NDAA says they can detain us indefinitely. Concentration camps have been there since the 50s. Back in the 1950s, the liberal Democrats, Humphrey and Lehman, introduced legislation to set up internment camps in case people got out of control. I don't know. I never followed to see what happened, but I know the legislation was passed. But they can't do anything about it. I mean, take, say, the surveillance systems. Okay, they shouldn't have systems. We shouldn't tolerate systems where everything you say gets sent to a central computer, massive supercomputer in Utah, and they do this and that. But even if they have that data, what are they going to do with it? I mean, nothing. In fact, they give you experiences with the FBI from resistance days. They can't do anything with it. And if they try, they'll arouse a popular reaction. So power really is in the hands of the governed, if they're willing to use it. And so what can we do, given that we're people with privilege? We have an enormous number of things we can do. I mean, there may be efforts to shut you up or something, but you're not going to be sent to have your brains blown out. It's not like El Salvador. I think kids are ready for it. They just have to pay attention. Most people just don't pay attention, either because they think everything's hopeless, I mean, it's kind of driven into your heads that everything is hopeless. There's nothing you can do. The powers are too great, you know. And in fact, the sense of hopelessness in the country is astonishing. So, for example, if you look at polls, over half the population thinks that Congress ought to be totally thrown out and replaced by your neighbors. You know, they'll do a better job. Approval of Congress is in single digits. Nobody thinks I can do anything about it. It's like these peasants in Brazil, you know. How can somebody like me do anything about it? In fact, you take a look at some of the, you know, take, say, the 9/11 movement, which is kind of interesting. Not the content, but just the phenomenon. You know, the Bush blew up World Trade Center, that kind of thing. It appeals to, I mean, it has a sympathy, at least, of, I forget the numbers, I think it's about a third of the population, a huge part of the population. That means that a large part of the population is willing to accept the possibility that we're run by a bunch of homicidal maniacs who are trying to murder us all, but they don't think they can do anything about it. So don't lift a finger to do anything. Okay, that's the way it is. We'll kind of hide in the corner and wait till it happens. But when people are kind of, I mean, some of the most effective kinds of propaganda are the kinds that allow you to see what's going on. So you see 99%, 1%, but to feel, I can't do anything about it. I'm, you know, isolated, alone. I don't talk to anybody. People like me can't do anything. We just have to suffer and bear it. That's really effective propaganda. I mean, that's the way, that's how slavery could last forever without many slavery rebellions. It's how women were oppressed. So like take, say, my grandmother's generation. If my grandmother had been asked if she's oppressed, she wouldn't have even known what you're talking about. That's life. You know, women are doormats. That's life. You get to my mother's generation, still plenty of oppression, but and she was bitter about it, but she didn't think you could do anything about it. By the time you get to today, it's quite different. It's very much like the peasants in Brazil, or the indigenous people in Bolivia, or you know, the blacks in the South after the early days of the civil rights movement. Yeah, we can do something about it. Even if it's brutal and harsh and we might get killed, we can do something. You know? And it's, that transition is very, and I think when you get back to your question, for a lot of young people, I think it's, you know, it's called apathy, but I suspect it's more hopelessness, powerlessness. And people can learn you're not powerless. Just take a look at what's been done. Take a look at what other people have done under, you know, much harsher conditions than you'll ever face, and what's been done right here in your own country. And, you know, the 60s really did civilize the country. I mean, it's a very different country from what it was in 1960. And it's mainly young people who just didn't give up, didn't feel, okay, we can't do anything. Actually, sometimes it's kind of dramatic. Like for years, what's called McCarthyism, which did intimidate people tremendously. I remember I lived through it. And people were just scared out of their wits. They couldn't do anything. The House Un-American Activities Committee, if people were called, they just trembled in fear. What can you do? But in the 1960s, people like Abbie Hoffman started just making fun of them. And they collapsed, you know. It's a very thin structure of power. I mean, as soon as you submit it to ridicule or you dismiss it, it can collapse. And this has been understood for centuries. So you go back to, say, David Hume, who was one of the great founders of classical liberalism, a great philosopher, but he wrote a book that he called, I think it was called The Foundations of the Theory of Government or something like that. And in it, he poses a kind of a paradox. He says in every society, whether it's, you know, the feudal dictatorship, military dictatorship, semi-parliamentary system like England, whatever it is, He says power is always in the hands of the governed, those who are being ruled. Power is always in their hands. So how come they just don't overthrow the rulers and take things for themselves? He says, well, the secret, he says, always, every society is control of opinion and attitudes. If you can convince people, if the powerful can convince people, you have to stay in your slot. That's where you belong. And that's your role in life. There's nothing to be changed. Then the rulers can control them. And you take a look at the history of revolutions, significant changes. It's when people broke out of that. So not long before Hume, and he may have had this in mind, in England a century before, there was a major conflict between Parliament and the king. The Parliament is basically the bourgeoisie and landowners and so on. It wasn't the general population. And the question is the king above the law? King Charles insisted that he was above the law. The Parliament, led by jurists and others, was saying, no, Magna Carta determined that the king is subject to the law, to at that time the nobles, in the Parliament. And there was a real major conflict about it. In fact, later soon led to a brutal civil war. But the Parliament stuck it out and compelled the king to sign something conceding that he was not above the law. It was very, at that time, the king was regarded as a representative of God, and you didn't fiddle around with God. That's serious business. So it was essentially standing up against a kind of divine authority, not our society. That meant something then. And to break through that was very difficult, but they did. That led to constitutional parliament, to a parliamentary monarchy, which is different from feudal monarchy.